Good morning, everybody. Back to Coffee with Captain Miles of the Pride of Baltimore 2 and Chief Mate Jeff Crosby behind the camera on a warm Maryland day, fairly humid, so we're happy to be inside talking to you.
Very warm. And it's only going to get warmer.
Yeah.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us this morning. I hope you got news of the time shift to Saturday mornings here. So to start us off, this time last year we were making our approaches to Bay City, Michigan in Lake Huron, and Pride is no stranger to the Great Lakes. As a matter of fact, there's an organization called Tall Ships America that puts together festival circuits every 3 years and invites tall ships to come through the Great Lakes for a series of port stops, and Pride has been a part of that a number of times. Pride has gone up there on her own a number of times. Do you have one of your more memorable experiences of being in the Great Lakes?
Yeah, so it relates to my first trip up there, but I have a preamble. So
that's great.
My father watches me become a professional and go from being a hand to a mate, and then I have my first command. And he actually winds up helping me with the delivery between Greenport, Long Island, and the Caribbean. And that's in the days before electronic navigation was available to that particular boat. So I was doing it Celestial, and it was all these things.
What boat was this?
That was the Rachel and Ebenezer.
Okay.
So anyway, he came away from that thinking I was pretty dialed in.
Sure.
So a couple years later, I get this offer to take the Pride of Baltimore in 1981 to the Great Lakes.
So this would have been the first boat.
First boat. And so he gets all puffy. He stands taller than I am. I'm near 6'4", he's 6'8". So he gets all like this. Well, the lakes will make a man of you, boy. He's from Chicago, so he knows the lakes a great deal. And he was more or less referencing how you can get into a pretty raucous experience on the lakes because of the difference in specific gravity of the water. The wave crest distance between crests gets shorter in the lakes. So anyway, Armin Alcesser, who is the first staff captain with Pride Inc., had set up the itinerary going in the lakes, and we used 100 miles a day for the first boat. Well, no one had taken into account, and I didn't review the situation, what was going to happen between Montreal and Toledo, which was one leg. There are 14 locks. There's almost 300 feet or 400 feet of lift. And you've got to wait for the other vessels to go through these one-way locks. So we were way, way, way behind in our effort. So it was, and then when we get to Lake Erie, we had a nice sail across Lake Ontario, but when we get to Lake Erie, it's blowing northwest.
Oh, great.
And so we wound up having one of the anchors on the weather side, on the starboard side, being actually tossed aboard by the waves.
Oh, wow.
So we were reefed down and going. We made it. We were on time, but it was a slog. And so ever since then, I laugh at my father's little bluster, but not that I was specifically unprepared, because we had this compression of time between two ports. We should have had easily another 2 days added to the transit in order to accommodate the logistics of the lakes, because you're waiting for the one-way traffic, you've got to take a turn, all that sort of stuff. But because we were in such a hurry, we were pushing the envelope a little bit. And Lake Erie, coming out of just going into Lake Erie out of the canal on the Welland, coming out of the Welland, we had a little bit of a boisterous effort. It was blowing 20, 25, but that short sea was just steep and
it can get really rough.
We get out from behind the lee and it's bang, bang, bang. And we had to actually lift the starboard anchor in and put it on deck.
Yeah.
Because she's a smaller boat and a lower freeboard boat, but anyway, we made it. But you cannot have a sense of the lakes.
Yeah, it's a lake. It's fine. A lake, you know, what can go wrong?
Yeah.
that certainly is memorable. Well, good morning, everyone. For those of you just tuning in. And we're continuing our conversation about seamanship. So hopefully you have watched the previous episode. If you haven't, that's all right. There's going to be a lot of new stuff without referencing what we've already talked about. But we have a couple of questions that were asked the last go-around that we didn't get to. So as you're watching this, if you have questions about seamanship, please post them in the comments and we'll address those as we go along. So the first question comes in from Steve Alm. It has been mentioned that with the rake of the masts, the main boom doesn't swing out in light air. And why can't that be corrected with cutting the sailcloth so when the gaff is all the way up, the boom is level?
So, the geometry of a mast that is raked and the mast does not twist, but the boom swings on the mast, or the gaff swings on the mast. In this case, a boom gaff sail are both being hoisted in reference to the raked mast. Uh-huh. So when the gaff swings, it comes out of alignment of the rake, and so the rake reduces as it affects the gaff. So the gaff actually rises. So I don't know if it can be. So if you got a hoisting mast and you're hanging everything off the mast, and the gaff is like and so, if the gaff is swinging, what happens is it's swinging up as the mast becomes relative to the gaff and it's becoming less raked. So you can't avoid the lift. So the boom does the same thing. Now, because of the four-sided sail being a double bias cloth, it's not as stiff and as unable to torque to change its shape because of stretch and the way the weave works. What we'll find we can do, and I've often done, is I've seen a wrinkle in the throat, and I've eased the gaff to reduce that wrinkle. Because as the gaff gets higher and higher and higher, the over-peaking creates a compression, and then you get these semi-vertical wrinkles. And that's a strain on the eyelets when you lash to the boom, rather the head of the head of the sail to the gaff and to the hoops. But the other thing you can do is ease the topping lift, because we don't leave the boom solely on the sail much of the time unless we're going to windward and we're strapped into a breeze. Then there'll be a situation where the boom is being held by the mainsail. But other than that, the boom is held by the topping lift. So the same thing that happens with the gaff happens to the boom, and the boom goes out, and because the rake becomes less relative to the boom swing, the boom lifts up, which is a great advantage at sea in a rolling sea. But if you're in smooth water and you want to put tension back in the leech, because the leech is going to get soft, the gaff is going to be lighter, and so what will happen is you'll get this lift that can be more than you want for the wind breeze. So you might ease the topping lift and lower the boom down a bit. But cutting a sail differently is not going to change the reality of what happens is when you're hanging objects off of a leaning spar.
A fixed leaning spar.
This fixed leaning spar, as it swings to the side, it's going to go up unless you adjust the lifting mechanism. So it's just the nature of the beast. It's also a period factor. They couldn't do it any other way. Their reasons for their rake were theirs. We're still puzzling over them, but and I think we know the answer. We just don't know what they were thinking. I think it was all related about keeping the spars in the boat under a press of wind, whereas being vertical, being as tall as they are, the aspect ratio. You see, square riggers are very short mast sections, and so their triangular nature of their rigging is pretty short and square and well spread out. But in the case of schooners, it's a much higher aspect ratio. So I think there's a certain amount of concern about that. But that's also begging the question as to what were they doing when they were raking masts without standing rigging at all. And there's a fair amount of that in our early days all around the world. There are examples of that way early. So
typically not on boats as big as Pride.
Yeah.
Starts in your smaller boats,
Yeah.
your more local watercraft.
So when rope came along, why didn't they take the rake out? Well, we can talk about that too.
That's a whole different episode.
Right.
The next question is coming in from Tom Price. To what extent is sternway dangerous to pry? I know that some ships with similar rudders, it can be a damage to the steering and rudder, but the ability to back up might be useful in battle conditions.
Yeah, battle conditions. They do that all the time. Well, in the case of the first pride and the second pride, there was no particular concern about sternway. There was concern about control and shift. So if you had sternway on, you had to be mindful about shifting off of center or having it already hard over before you gain the sternway.
The rudder shifting off the center.
Yeah. So in the case of the first boat, it was a tiller control. So you'd have to warn the helmsman to be mindful, or you had to make a decision. You either lashed it amidships, or you lashed it to one side, or held it to one side, and you knew you were going to be backing up a fair amount of speed. Well, what's a fair amount of speed? Well, when you're in sailing conditions, you're losing way going through attack, and you're getting in irons, as it's called, when you get sort of caught up in that situation, and the vessel develops sternway before it falls off to the side you want to go to, and sometimes you lose control, it goes back the way you don't want to go. What kind of speed is that? Well, it's less than 3 knots.
Yeah.
So the rudder is very strong. The issue is abrupt stop. So if you lose control of the rudder and it swings and comes up hard, now that's a concern. So if you make your decisions early. Now in the case of Pride of Boat number 2, she's a wheel. And she's twin screw. So I've been in motor maneuvering situations where I've opted to back up. Mm-hmm. And because I want to get something done either relatively quickly or I need to go a fair distance, I'll get some speed on it. So that's when I'll tell the helmsman amidships and keep it amidships and hang on like grim death, because when I do other things, it's going to jiggle and woggle. And we might do 5, 6, 7 knots in a short distance situation. We might reach that peak, and then stop her, and then I'll use rudder stuff for that. But when it comes to the business of losing forward way or even under sail, I've gotten into attack where I had to back out of it. Mm-hmm. So getting ready to attack, something happens, decide to change my mind, have the crew square the yards, square the topsail, and she comes to a stop. She's head to wind, and I don't have. It's not always easy to control which way she goes, but it didn't matter in that situation. I just let her back up.
Sure.
So then when I realized which way she's going to go, then I shifted the rudder before she developed any speed. And then when it's hard over like that, it's not a problem. Now with a whirling gear, you have better control than a tiller might in that scenario, backing up and you want to shift. But it's also not important to shift, because once the bow goes, no matter what you do with the rudder, it's going to go and keep going now.
Yeah.
So there's sort of like, so the big thing is controlling the speed with which the rudder is moving before it hits the stop. And if you can control it by grabbing the wheel with a whirling gear, and you can keep it from abruptly ending over on the hard stops, then maybe you can be a little more nuanced about the use of the rudder while backing up. But with a tiller, unless you have 2 tackles or a lot of people on and you're backing up, I would say that you have to be pretty careful or make your decision early. So, but I would say that speeds of 2 to 3 knots max are not a problem. And if you're going to go that much faster, it's probably best to not think in terms of the rudder being available to you, and just even, I would never go 6, 7 knots with the rudder hard over.
Right. With
a twin screw pride. So it would be make a commitment that you're going to do this, or that might happen. Put it in midships, and then let everything out. Yeah, keep it there.
Cool. So kind of picking up where we left off last week, we were in the midst of a conversation about heavy displacement, heavy weight seamanship. So what are some aspects of pride where we're dealing with weight, and how do we deal with weight, especially when it comes to the rig?
Well, I think the one you have to have the most respect for is the boom.
Yeah.
And there's a transitory process between when the sail is down and secured and the sail is set, where managing that weight is a discipline. And you might be in smooth water and be able to let it hang in its lifts while you're going through the process of setting the sail. Common technique in sloops and catches, anything with a boom, it's pretty easy to say cast the boom free, so it's free to go and then raise the sail. But in the case of heavy weights, you don't do that. You maintain that. And then when the sail is up to the point where it's actually taking some of the control of the boom, then you can start to ease it off. We're at sea, we'll have a situation where the main is set and it's drawing. It might be a close reach, or it might be a beam reach, or particularly a run, where if it's a close reach and the boom is not that far out, but there's a bit of a sea, if the main sheet starts to go slack and there's a bump, slack and a bump, slack and a bump, that's a cue. And it's not necessarily dangerous by itself, but it's within moderate acceleration of the motion. But it's a cue that you need to get the preventer tackle rigged.
What is a preventer tackle?
So the boom is out of distance. You got the main sheet holding it, but it's swinging in and slamming out, and swinging in and slamming out. And so we have a tackle arrangement that hooks way up forward by the foremast channels, and then with a multi-tackle, we join the pennant to the tackle. There's 4 or 5-part tackle on the boom. And then when that's pulled together, the crew can haul the boom out against the main sheet. And when that's all snubbed up, then you have that control.
Yeah.
And it can be, and it's particularly when you're going overnight, you need to commit to holding on to the boom. So it's only when you're really trimmed in close that you don't use that preventer. And sometimes we'll use with the quarter tackle when we're close in trim, when we get light air, get a bit of a roll, the boom is coming in anyway. We'll use, because of the closeness of the boom, we'll use a different tackle, a quarter tackle, and keep that from letting the boom get wild.
Right. Because it's a pretty heavy spar.
Yeah, other heavy lift, it's just the business of understanding hoisting and lowering. So we have a topsail yard, so we like to get it down fast. But because people are sensitive about weight, there's a tendency to inch it out over the pin. And we're training people to recognize that even though they're not looking up because they're looking at the pin and they're easing at the line, they can go faster.
Right.
We have to train for that. We have to explain.
There's a fair amount of purchase that it needs to render around through.
And it wouldn't be any different than a modern yacht with a winch and you're trying to ease out strain. You know, you got to keep your fingers out of it. So you got to be looking. So you're listening to somebody else make the call. But you can sometimes be pretty quick with that without losing any kind of control if you know what you're doing. So there's that whole process. And most of the schooners don't have winches. And not many of them have topsail yards. And there's only one pretty active square rigger in the business, and that's up there in the Great Lakes. So there are needs to know about your own vessel, and so controlling that weight. And some of her spars would be somewhat heavier than ours, and so
that's the
Niagara, yeah. So when it comes to and then braces, you never let a yard fly.
Right.
So you're in a rolling sea, and you're always managing how that yard. It's going to move just because it's all about rope and there's undulation in the rig, but you always dampen that move. That means you always secure it so that it can't swing and then come to an end and spring back again. Because that creates jerk, and jerk is no good for any of the gear.
Yeah.
It's unseemly anyhow, and then if anybody's near it, you're going to toss them off the rig, so off the yard. So it's you control your weights. You can see movement, you can accept movement, but it's got to be managed, and it's about avoiding the jerk by quite a bit.
When it comes to the heaviest gear on the boat, being the main, what's the difference between the Evolution's tacking and jibing and the control factor of that weight?
Well, so when you're coming about, the sails are trimmed in.
Yeah.
So you're just making them go back. And then you choose what order you're going to handle one sail at a time, or if you have enough people and the wind is not that strong, more than one sail at a time and passing it over. And the boom, being the one boom that we have, just swings around from being trimmed in close to being trimmed in close the other way. And there's no particular control feature with that.
It's
Extra
kind of
control.
self-tending.
Yeah, self-tending. Now, when you jibe, the boom is way, way, way out there to begin with. It's got the preventer tackle on it.
Yeah.
And all the other sails are way trimmed out. And the yards are trimmed somewhat square. So what will happen is you have to decide how to control the canvas and control the gear. Mm-hmm. So when you bear away deep, there's shadowing that occurs. So the headsails collapse. And the foresail, because it's loose-footed, collapses. So because if you were to leave them adjusted way out and therefore collapsing and moving around, and you then jibe the main, you'd wind up with a lot of loose gear crossing the deck for the foresail, and just the head rig. So depends upon the circumstances. We always control those loose-footed sails. So we'll bear down away from the wind, create a bit of a shadow, pull in the foresail, and get it trimmed in for close in, as if we were tacking, trimmed in tight. The headsails depends upon the circumstances. If it's a smooth sea situation like here in the bay, we may not do that. But otherwise, we take in all the sheets snug, flatten the headsails, and then come back and start to manage the main. We also have running backstay gear, so we have to shift that. That's a sequence. So you bring the foresail in, get it trimmed in close, bring back the fore topmast running backstay. Oops, we got a water maker making noise. Actually, it's not a water maker, it's an ice machine. Yeah. So now to help with the business of the yards are trimmed for a particularly broad reach. You want to jibe. Mm-hmm. After we get the loose-footed sails geared in, taken in so that we're not flogging gear, not going to knock people around, not going to get underneath somebody's leg and flip them when it suddenly rises up like a sheet comes up and it tosses somebody around because it's after dark and they're not seeing that they're stepping across something like that.
Yeah.
I mean, these are the consequences that can happen if you're not managing the situation in a sequential way. So the rolling factor will come into play. So if we were to jibe without retrimming the topsail, we would wind up with no power in the topsail. Mm-hmm. That's not the end of the world, but by shifting before we do the job of the main, we've taken everything, trimmed everything in except the main, then shift the yards. They're losing their power. The topsail's losing its power a little bit, but we're going pretty broad. We then bring the main around. Then when we shift around, we have the main driving on the new jibe. We have the topsail full and driving as well. And the other sails are back. So we keep a balance control by doing that. So we'll shift the yards. Then we put everybody back on the main, and that's a matter of easing away the preventer in a controlled fashion, because in a rolling sea, the boom can get ahead of the sheet people.
Yeah.
So you have to break the preventer. Or other occasions, you got to cast it off because the wind's filling the sail, and you really got
to be able to haul.
You got to give the four sheet people a chance.
Kind of be mindful of what sea state there is and whether or not you need to snub it a little bit.
Yeah, exactly. Snap it or let it go. Snub it, let it go. Yeah. And so then the main boom is brought in tight, and we're still sailing on the reach. And then people get into a position to deal with the fact that we've got to preventer tackle to unhook and move it to the other side, which is no small matter when you're dealing with a 4 to 5 part object.
And all of the things on the deck. And
But then you need somebody on the sheet particularly if it's a fairly fresh breeze, to then be ready to ease away right away. So you can soften the jibe of the main as the gaff comes across, fetches up on the leech of the main, and everything comes in snug, hard, fast. And then there's a running backstay story for the main topmast. So it's coordination. It's a lot more confusing for jibing for the crew.
Right.
Where am I supposed to go?
What is this?
What's next? What's next? Than it is to tack.
Sure.
So it's a lot of loose gear that you and the loose gear, because of the loose-footed foresoles and headsoles, there's a lot of loose gear that occurs when you get the wind shadowing with the main. So you need to control that. So you over control by trimming in flat and getting in tight, and then you can let things pass over. Got the main running mainstays too to deal with.
Yeah.
With the foresole.
Gotta throw those into the process.
Right. Yeah. So there's a lot to do that seems to be confusing for a jibe that don't seem to be confusing for a tack.
Yeah.
And I think it's because the sails are already trimmed in tight, so you're just waiting for them to go back. And we don't have to fiddle with the running back stays when we're going to windward. Both can stay up. Both sides can stay up. So it's a real change of concentration and routine.
Routine and movement.
Yeah.
Jim has kind of a fun question here. Jim Strebeck. How about the feeling between jibing Pride 2 versus jibing Clearwater when you had her?
Well, that's a fun game with her. I mean, if you've never done a North River jibe, first of all, they didn't always do it, but then in the case of the Clearwater, but then history tells us it was a very common practice. So you don't trim in the main sheet. And I'll do this sometimes with the Pride in the Chesapeake Bay. I'll say, okay, we're going to, and with the rake, it gets to be sort of interesting because you ease off the preventer. Yeah. The rake brings the boom all the way in. You got the main sheet is over the side, dragging in the water, and then you got to let it glide across. The eyes get bigger as everybody thinks of what can go wrong. You pick up the main sheet, bring it around the wheel, bring it around the box, make sure it doesn't go around the stern and tear off all the GPS gear, and then you let her go on. Well, this is what's going on with the Hudson River jibe. That mast is vertical. There is no rake. So that boom doesn't do anything but go anywhere the wind blows the mainsail.
Yeah.
And there is no resistance other than the weight, catenary weight of the main sheet, which is multi-part like ours is, Pride's is. So what will happen is you go to a jibe point with the main all the way out, as far out as you can make it. And because the base of the rigging is real narrow, you can make it go darn near 90 degrees to the ship.
Yeah.
And then you turn her by the lee, not real fast necessarily, but you could if you have the coordination. And you turn and turn and let the mainsail go aback without trimming it in. Mm-hmm. Then you hard turn the helm right away because you really want to start rounding up while this main is now traveling at greater and greater and greater speed, and you make sure you've got people there with the main sheet to make sure it won't go around the davits.
Yeah.
And then you chuck it over the other side. And by the time it's getting ready to stretch the main sheet out on the new jibe, the boat's nearly head to wind.
Yeah.
The sail just runs into the wind the other side, backs, and you don't have that. And if you coordinate that nicely, she's a centerboard boat, so she can be turned pretty quick for her length and her size. So that's the North River jibe. So you never sheet in. I mean, it's miles of rope if you were, because it's like 4 parts, and it's a 70-odd foot boat, which means the boom has got to be 80 feet long, which means when it's out 90 degrees to the ship, you got the hypotenuse you're playing with there.
Right.
And so, so it's fun because there's no sea. Now, you would not be able to do that in the sea.
Right.
So you'd have to do what we just explained about second Pride of Baltimore. You'd have to trim it in and 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 then jibe. And then because they were cargo boats, their bows are pretty bluff. Trying to tack them in a bit of a sea, if the sea's big enough for the amount of wind that's on, you may have to jibe her anyway, just because she's going to go dead into the water into the sea. So it's tough. Those boats are very interesting to sail with, and they're really about the river, about sheltered areas and narrow bodies of water. So you don't have any rake. They're a pretty more recent design too. I don't know how early the so-called Hudson River sloop is, but in a smaller version, you wouldn't have to have any rake. You did a big enough spar. You can have a vertical mast and not have any shrouds. But the reality is the wind goes up the river or it goes down the river.
One of the two.
Not a lot of reaching in that river.
Yeah.
Or at least
one thing that you mentioned last week that I want to kind of talk about a little bit more, when it comes to crew training, you mentioned that we need to teach crew to be able to handle gear in the dark. I mean, we're in the modern age. We have LED lights. Why can't we just light everything up?
we do, and it's horrifying. It is horrifying. I'm sorry, I'm an old fart from generations ago.
Yeah.
What do you mean? So the discipline in my day was if you have to have a light, you put your body between the helm and what it is you're trying to light up.
Yeah.
Well, that discipline is totally gone.
Right.
And it's interesting how the LED has developed over time between being next to impossible to deal with because it's just too bright, to how it's actually got different colors now and it's not so hard. But still, and I'm pretty lazy about it, but they should be only thinking in terms of making sure their body is between the helmsman and the aft, the quarterdeck, and what it is they're trying to light up.
Yeah.
But more often than not, there's enough light to work without a light.
Just ambient light. General.
Ambient light, yeah. I would say that you got a moonless night. You have heavy cast sky. That's when you're really going to want to have. You're driven to want to have a light. So the question is do you know your rig well enough to live without a light? Because then the contrast of a light, even a colored light, is huge.
Yeah.
So it's our maneuvers offshore mean we're not in close quarters, means we have a lot of forgiveness. And so the only time you're in a rush is because you've got a weather change that's coming down pretty rapidly. So we have spreader lights on the boat. I will use them as a way of taking care of the moonless, heavy cast sky at night that's so dark. Because again, it's about being able to get it done. And and today with navigation and piloting, you know where you are.
Yeah.
With the electronics, you just know. So you can throw away some of that old tradition. And I might grumble, but I turn the lights on to get their job done. I know where we are, and I know because it's lit up electrically. There's a light that's showing me where I am in a chart. So, yeah, it's the sensitivities to the business of light have gotten a lot less arch because of the circumstances of we know where we are to inches almost.
Yeah, because I mean, it is quite remarkable. I'm always surprised, when you flip on the spreader lights, how much visibility you lose as far as looking past the cap rail of the boat. Yeah. It's always a bit of a shock.
So think in terms of putting on spreader lights back in the days when you might not know exactly where you are.
Yeah, it'd be horrifying.
So the old Pride of Baltimore had spreader lights, and the old Pride of Baltimore didn't have a radar as a general rule. We had it down below, but didn't have it. So you could get a situation where turning on the spreader lights was a real question of where were we and how important was it to see the deck versus see where you are. So you're maneuvering around in the Chesapeake Bay and really, or some narrow area, bay area, on approach to a port for the next day, and you're sailing, and you really want to sail. You could ask yourself the question: can't you guys figure out where the damn pin is? We've been on this boat for months. We've been doing this for months. Why is this a problem? Yeah. But today it's sort of like you're beating a dead dog because they're looking at you. Well, wait a minute. You know where you are.
Yeah. Why don't you help me out here?
Yeah. Right.
Yeah. Yeah. So lights, we can use them, but still preferable. I think it kind of to not use them to instill basically that knowledge of where things are and what they're doing when you pull on them. Because it's not just maneuvering at night that you can't visually see what's going on. There are a lot of times you'll be pulling on a line and you just don't have the sight line, to see what's happening. So knowing what you're pulling on and what that's doing is super helpful.
Yeah, understanding the geometry is really important.
Yeah. Kind of along with this, let's talk about our responses to squalls. So kind of two different scenarios. One is we're in an area with a lot of squall activity, and what's the preparation for that, and how do we kind of manage that scenario, versus we're sailing along, sunny day, beam reach, and then a squall starts approaching. So how do we handle both of those scenarios?
Well, we had an interesting one last year in the Great Lakes with a forecast of threat of squall. We were coming, as you remember, in Lake Michigan. We were coming out of, starting to head back towards Canada after being, what's the name of that port? All of a sudden I lost it. But anyhow, the forecast was pretty clear about later on today there are going to be some concentrated activities.
Yeah.
And we were in a position of not having to be in a super hurry. So we didn't set the main. And we were sailing with just the daysail combo and maybe the jib. And then with the radar, we were able to see the development. And so we had a pretty moderate process for getting things under control. And yet we still kept some sail up as we were dealing with the wind change, because we were under sail, we weren't powering at the time. And it was a matter of assessing when the wind change would occur and would we still be able to sail with the wind direction change. And so at some point in that evening squall situation, we took the topsail, got it stowed, had the foresail and the staysail on her, and then I decided that we needed to get the foresail in and get it all down. And we did, I think, is how I remember that. Maybe I got that confused. But the point I'm making is that we can be pretty respectful for the geography of the area for the fact that, and with modern forecasting, we're well ahead. Now, back in 1981, with the old Pride of Baltimore, in that exact same scenario, and we're sailing, you'd have had to probably make the decision pretty early on that you're going to go motoring or take it all down, because as it turned out, we wound up with a 180-degree wind change and 40 knots of wind.
Right.
And so, you can think of the days when they didn't know the weather was coming, other than their by Mark 1 eyeball sense of it, and yet they're under sail and they're surrounded by land. You're in a lake.
Yeah,
it's a big lake, but you're surrounded by land.
Yeah.
So how do you maintain control? So the ability to have the patience to bear away and just go in an open water direction to cope with and then of course cargo schoonering. Imagine the Dennis Sullivan with a cargo and 3 or 4 people on it, and they were in that scenario. Is you'd have to have the sense to. You'd have to see the future, and none of us can, to understand the potential risks. You could get that, you could reduce sail, but you're still trying to get somewhere. You don't want to go the wrong way, so you don't take all your sail in, and you get 40 out of 180 degrees. You get 40 odd knots. It could be more, and so take it all in, go the other way. When do you decide to go the other way? Because it's a 180-degree wind change.
Yeah.
Now, when we've been in more stable conditions and not as strong a forecast, or that there's or clouds developing, today with radar, even for quite now 20 or more years, 30 years, radar has been a great aid for understanding that an echo could represent some wind. Mm-hmm. And so you can get ahead of that. And then you have frontal weather change. So we had a surprise that was a real surprise. Mm-hmm. It was a midday thing. It was up around the Gaspé. I was taking a nap. I got called up, and we were on a close reach, port tack, going north. and there was this edge. It was almost like a spaceship, a circular spaceship, but a huge thing. And it was a cloud that had a bit of, not a really sharp. It was soft. It was fluffy. It was like cotton, and it was kind of round, and it was in a big arc, and it was advancing down, and it wasn't advancing that fast. And they had time to get me. Take a look at it, and I'm looking at this thing out of a map, and I'm kind of, it's almost three-dimensionally optical illusion. It was so soft, and yet it was so evident.
Yeah.
And it wasn't that sharp squall line. It was just all by itself. It had no particular cloud attached to it. It was just this ring of cotton, really uniform, very broad curve coming. So it took a long time to decide what to do about it. I said, okay, let's get some sail down. So we got the jib top down, but then we started to feel the wind. And so I bore away, and I can't remember exactly how then. I think we eased sail. Is what we did. We eased the main and bore away. And we didn't have to bear away a whole lot, but we got the wind on the beam, and then it died out. Went flat calm.
So it might have actually been a spaceship.
Yeah.
That's it.
Compression wave.
Right. That's it as it goes by.
So, I mean, it was sunny. It was high cirrus cloud otherwise. There was nothing going on. So it was like, wow, that's pretty interesting. I'm glad we bore off, because had we not eased sheets to bear away, and we were bearing away before the wind velocity hit, so we were eased when it hit. We eased the square, we eased the main, and then eased the fore as we were bearing away. And we got up to 7, 8, 9 knots in a say 15, 18 squall, something like that, of wind. No rain, no nothing. There was no density to it, but it was I'm sure from a weather point of view, someone who knew that kind of weather would say there's a reason for this.
This is exactly what's happening.
But I'm sorry. It had no real rhyme or reason to it in my experience. So, yeah. So that we got but it certainly was not devastating.
Right.
Now, we've been pushing the envelope a few times where we know there's a squall. We can see the squall. And it's a matter of timing and assessment of when it's going to arrive, and then making decisions all the time, redeciding how much is going to be done. And so we had that race coming up from Bermuda in 2017 to Boston, and we had that squall coming on. So we got we had a lot of sail up. We were beam reaching. I don't think we had the stunsail up, but we were beam reaching, and but we had the gallant. So we had to get the gallant down, the main top down, get a headsail 2 down, and get the main down. And we were bearing away in front of the wind, and the wind was rising, and the main was still up.
Sure.
So we had to fight the main down, and that's that whole process of in fact, one crew member went up to push the sail off the lee shroud a little bit to let it down, because the gas coming down, gas scandalized, and we're pulling the reefs, and it's coming down. It's just that it would have been nice if we'd made the decision 10 minutes earlier.
Right. A little bit of extra.
But we were racing. Come on.
Yeah. You gotta get that edge somehow.
So, and it was a rainy squall. It was a dense squall.
Yeah.
And we bore away, and we were going dead downwind with it. No topsail. Topsail was in. It took time to get it furled, as I recall, to get it sea stowed, which is one of the reasons that we took a little long time, because sometimes we won't do that. But I was feeling that we needed to do that. So we used up a little bit of time before getting the main down. And that was after dark. The crew did a great job.
Yeah.
So,
so you mentioned a couple of different times the strategy of bearing away when a squall hits, and that's pretty common with heavy displacement boats. Why is that versus in kind of more modern sailing, you have the option of feathering into it?
Well, I would say that an angled deck, you get a big boat. Well, it's over 26 feet of beam. And we're at 15 degrees of heel. What's that like to walk around? Now you're in this 25-foot beam boat, 26-foot beam boat, and you're at 25 degrees of heel. What's that like? You lose your grip, you're going to fall.
Yeah.
And you're not going to fall down. You're going to fall across the deck on a 25-degree angle of heel, and you're going to slide some distance. So the effectiveness of crew is one of the key contributions to considering getting bore away. Because if you can keep the deck relatively level, the crew can do anything.
Yeah. It increases your time to do that. Yeah.
Now, with bigger boats, you're standing up, so your center of gravity a constant center of gravity is a standing height above deck gravity. When you're in a low freeboard, narrow boat, it can even be pretty long, like 60, 80 feet long, even I would say 60, 80 feet long. Your beam is not that wide. Your freeboard is way down low. You're on your knees anyway.
Right.
Well, if their freeboard is not low, particularly if the freeboard is pretty high, you can be at 35 degrees and not have water on deck. So you're down on your knees doing everything anyway. So you have the option. And with fore and aft sail plans, there's a different dynamic to the business of controlling the angle of heel than it is when you got a hermaphrodite rig. So I think the Barraway is more, not so much about the fore and aft rig, it's about the square in some respects. And then there's the business of you can reduce the overall forces involved. If you're going head to wind, no matter what you are, you're going to have angle of heel until you finally get it down. And so how do you do that when the lee rail is buried in the water? So if you can be bore off ahead of it and keep the deck relatively level, then the crew can do anything. And they're not hindered by other factors because of the angle of heel, whether it's be water or whatever. So anyhow, I would say that even for fast yachts, modern designs, you're going to be better off keeping the deck relatively level, and people are going to be much more able to do what they're going to get done, you reduce the pressure involved. Now, with modern rigs, there's a lot of problem with tracks, luff tracks, and I understand that. I had a conversation with a past crew member who's become a skipper of big modern yachts and roller gear going up into the mast. And he said, I said, what about ocean crossing? And you need to get this thing in. You're not going to round up into the wind, are you? Because sea could be pretty big. He says, we had this conversation, and I said, I can imagine you pulling in a jib pretty tight. Yeah. To give it a bit of a luff and go with a bit of an overly eased out sail so you can get this roller up into the mast. And he confirmed, but talking to the other captains, because he was pretty new to that business, he said, yeah, that's what they do. They trim in that headsail, that staysail, that inner jib, and put an over trim. And we can do that.
That kind of backs the
right, and it works well. And it works well. It can happen on Pride. You could over trim the fore, put a luff in it. Now, in the case of the Squall I just described in 2017, we had too much wind to play that game. We needed to be away. But if you don't have to be quite that far away, you can control how you get the gaff sail down by putting in a luff without having to go head to wind. You just ease the sail out, have a forward sail trimmed in, over trimmed. If the foresail's still on her and it's trimmed in tight, it'll reverse bow the mainsail, and it can help. But every situation is going to be special to the boat and special to the sequence of events leading up to the threat. Different missions, different goals. I mean, even when we're not racing, we like to sail everywhere. So I might be apt to hang on a little longer, and you could always just take it all in, turn on the engines, and be done with it.
Yeah.
Well, so you could argue that back and forth. It's hard on the crew, hard on the gears. Yeah, but we like to go sailing, so.
Yeah, it also could be a pretty good teaching opportunity. So we're coming up on the end of our time here this morning. So got one last question. A relatively common technique for dealing with heavy weather is heaving to. Does Pride ever heave to, especially in the middle of the ocean during heavy weather? Has she ever? Is that a valid strategy?
Well, heaving to is valid for a lot of reasons, not just because of heavy weather. Fortunately, I've not been in a position of having to heave to on the second Pride or even the first Pride for heavy weather. I was with the Rachel and Ebenezer on a second trip down to the islands. We got into the Gulf Stream or just across the Gulf Stream, and it was a pretty significant low coming by. And we hove to there, and we just bobbed and bobbed and bobbed. In the case of the Prides, particularly the second Pride, we've hove to for reasons of weather, but not serious weather. So one time it was coming up the coast of Florida. We had some time to kill, but it was a northerly wind, and it got up to around northeast. I think northerly actually got up to around 25, 30 knots. Why beat against that? Why motor against that when you have the time? So we hove to. So now with her windage forward, it's not heaving to with the foresail. Might be great from the point of view of convenience, but it means the boat blows away from the wind and puts the wind on the quarter, which means you're oscillating in a seaway, whatever that is, 6 to 8 feet, whatever it is. You're putting your windward quarter up and then coming around finally, and it's pretty uncomfortable riding. So I found that if you use the mainsail only and no other sail forward, she'll have a tendency to arc between, say, 30 degrees to the wind to around 80 degrees to the wind, and she'll stay. But there's a limit to that too. I would say that if things were, depending upon circumstances, you might better just go bare pole.
Sure.
And heave to that way. Because you don't get because in 30 knots with a full main, you'll get 25 degrees of angle of heel when she bore away, and then she responds to the wind again. So that's a little uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And it keeps her bow up. But the other thing you could do is just go with just bare pole, throw the helm up, and just see what she does. And if it's still a little uncomfortable, you could just sort of go run before her. And under bare pole, she's pretty fast, but that has to be taken into account. I mean, 30 knots of wind, she'll probably do 5 knots downwind, might even be more. So, so it's in our case, we're a fair weather sailor. We're seasonally in the fair weather, so we're not commercially sailing in the wintertime. So we're not beating our way to windward in breezes of greater than 25 knots as a general rule, particularly if the sea gets above 7 feet. I mean, then it's just the head rig, everything. It's just
really hard on the gear, hard on the crew, hard on the cook.
So so heaving to is a tool for sure, and it's a device for controlling the stresses of the moment. But it isn't. In our case, it's been more about waiting time out and not having to beat our brains out.
Sure.
Using the time.
Yeah.
To advantage.
That makes sense. Well, thank you everyone for joining us this morning. And if you donated, thank you very much. That helps keep Coffee with Captain going. Captain Miles, do you have any parting words for us?
In our world today, it's stay diligent.